Why do existentialists bother to write anything? Because the thing about existentialism is that it's really more an experience than it is about knowing something for certain. The existentialist project began at the end of modern philosophy, which was an attempt to sort of create a fundamental explanation. I've talked about Kant in the past, and his whole goal was to sort of describe the limits of reason and to find out exactly what we can hold to be totally certain. So existentialism takes off at the point where modern philosophy kind of gives up on trying to find the pure object of philosophy. Philosophy no longer is about trying to find the truth, and it becomes more about, something else. The priorities have to be rediscovered, and the existentialist project is ultimately aimed at an experience of understanding experience. It's an experience, a feeling of understanding toward experience, not trying to explain experience away or reduce it to something, but trying to just sit and have your experience and also have the feeling of understanding towards the things that you are experiencing. It's kind of like a Buddhist realization. There are distinctions, but I think existentialism is something like a Buddhist realization in a Western context. So I'll explain my own existentialist experience, which I would distinguish from a Buddhist experience. But it happened while I was meditating, so there's definitely a clear relationship there. But I'll describe the experience, and then I'll try and explain how I still think that after having the experience, existentialist philosophy was something that I pursued in search of repeating the experience. So what happened for me was I was alone meditating in the forest. And I began to think to myself, when I had lost my focus on just pure meditation, that to understand myself meant to understand my psyche. And the most scientific way of understanding the psyche is through the understanding of evolution and the effect of evolution on psychology. So I thought to myself, perhaps if I were to be alive for 5,000 to 10,000 years, and I had all that time to read about evolutionary psychology, that I would understand myself fundamentally. How everything that I did, I would have the feeling of understanding towards it. There'd be nothing left in my mind that I can do and as part of who I am that I couldn't explain. But then I realized that even if I got to that point of perfect psychological understanding, I wouldn't understand evolution in the first place. All of that understanding of the psychology that I got from evolution would rest on presumptions about evolution. So then I'd have to spend an additional 10,000 years reading about how evolution works. But then, of course, if I understood fundamentally, I understand my psyche, I understand evolution, and I could understand the whole lot, then I could say every single thing that happened to me and everything that happened to my mind, I could give an explanation for it, and reaching all the way back down to evolution. But then, of course, evolution didn't happen out of nothing. That also has its own explanations. And I just kind of went back and back and back, through psychology to biology, and then to geology and chemistry, because that's what gives rise to the rules of biology. And then, of course, you have to go, okay, well, why do geology and chemistry happen? Well, it happens because of physics and astrophysics. And then you have to take that back as well. If maybe fundamentally you could understand astrophysics and quantum mechanics, you could say, well, fundamentally I understand who I am at that stage. I can predict, I can use my mind to describe every single thing that I am fundamentally perfectly. And then I traced that all the way back, and I said, okay, but this all comes down to the origin of the universe. None of this astrophysics or physics stuff makes sense unless it's all justified by the origin. The Big Bang sets the rules of physics. And then I realized that the Big Bang, the origin of the universe, could never be explained. It is inherently unexplainable. That the desire I had to trace back everything in my experience to an explanation consumed itself. So I tried to use thought to reduce everything in my experience to an explanation in thought. But I reduced it all the way back to the point where thought no longer had any domain. So thought consumed itself. And the only thing that remained was experience. So I remember I opened my eyes and I looked at the trees, And this experience lasted only a few seconds, but it was a feeling of just purely existing, nothing else. Staring, looking, existing, breathing, and nothing to trammel that experience at all. Because it was as though the priority of thought had changed. All the time beforehand, I had been attempting to explain my experience. But once I realized the futility, the absolute impossibility of explaining experience in that way, thought stepped out the way of consciousness, and all I had was consciousness. So, that was my experience. And then, of course, I say, this experience only lasted a few seconds, and then I went back to sort of being consumed in thinking, and I tried to repeat the process, but it didn't give me the same realization. And I think the purpose of existentialist philosophy, the reason they write, is to try and instill patterns of thought that produce those experiences. So that was one pattern of thought that I had, the attempt to trace consciousness back to some origin that I can think of. But then the recognition of the futility of that project, and then therefore just returning to pure consciousness. But there are other ways of doing that, and I think those ways are outlined in the existentialist philosophers like Heidegger and Sartre. So if you have these thought processes, they essentially follow the same sort of pattern, I think, where there's an establishment of what you're thinking, the surface of your conscious mind, and you try and explain experience. But then the philosophy of the existentialist always sort of turns that thinking in on itself. Heidegger is notorious for his sort of reflexive philosophizing. He would say a point, he'd try and describe something about existence or being, and then he'd find assumptions or bits of information that prejudices, biases, pre-existing knowledge in each of those things, and try and interrogate those. But he found that it was kind of ongoing, that the very fact of thinking about existence takes one away from existence. And he's tried to perform the same sort of reflexive process that happened to me. But the fundamental realization is that consciousness precedes thought. So in my experience, I tried to reduce consciousness to something I could think. And I was met with the futility of that, and granted an experience. So what happens is thought goes out into the world and tries to explain things. That's the purpose of thought. It tries to explain what's around. It tries to explain, and that's very useful for human life. First of all, we need language to communicate with each other. We need thoughts in order to communicate who we are and what we want and our motivations, and to work out complex problems. We need to be able to think. But then we start looking at our consciousness. The utility of thought is so convincing that we start to think maybe we can explain consciousness. So we turn our thought in on our consciousness, and we walk around with a presumption that thought could explain consciousness, that all of the things that we experience in the world can be explained. But the existentialist philosophy, the point of existentialist philosophy is to demonstrate to your own thoughts that they cannot explain consciousness. So they turn the consciousness-thought divide on its head. Typically we walk around and we think that consciousness can be explained by thought. But through existentialist philosophy, we're able to turn that around, and we realize that no, consciousness cannot be explained by thought. Thought rests on consciousness. It's effectively the philosophy suggests to thought that it cannot pull itself up by its bootstraps. Thought is there, it thinks it can do more than it can. And once it realizes that it can't pull it up by its bootstraps, thought gets out of the way of consciousness. So thought becomes a tool which we can use if we choose to. But it becomes our tool, our slave, not our master. The master should always be consciousness. And that is something like a Buddhist experience, but maybe not quite the same, because it's arrived at by philosophizing. Although that philosophizing, you might say, is something like a Buddhist koan. But at the end of the day, the purpose is for the effect of existentialist philosophy is for thought to get out of the way of consciousness.